And now a reading from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, verses 1 through 18. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them when the Messiah was to be born. They told him, actually where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out. And there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Now after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night and went to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. A word of God still speaking. Thanks be to God. Will you decide who shall live and who shall die? I can guarantee that we don't think about the choices we make in our everyday life as determining who shall live and who shall die. Even the gifts we give to charity, we don't tend to think they have that kind of power. But we don't hesitate to hold somebody like Scrooge accountable. After all, he was really, really rich. He could make a difference in someone's life. And of course, jump forward to the end of the story. As we have just heard, we know he has the power to determine who shall live and who shall die. When the ghost of Christmas Present brought Scrooge to Bob Cratchit's home, Scrooge asked if Tiny Tim would live. And of course the spirit said, "I see a vacant seat in a poor chimney corner and a crutch without an owner carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." When Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, his primary purpose was not to give us entertainment during this Advent and Christmas season, but it was to wake up those with means to the responsibility and opportunity they had to make people's lives better, even to save a life. However, all of these years after Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, all of these years after it's become, for at least some of us, kind of a staple of our Christmas stories that we listen to every December, his goal seems to have fallen on deaf ears. Today, the gap between rich and poor just keeps getting wider and wider. Resources available for those who struggle to get by are dwindling, and the programs that can help them the most are at risk of being cut. Which begs the question, what is our responsibility toward our neighbor? It's an uncomfortable question, because most of us have way more than we need. And while the haves may help out the have-nots with a little charity every now and then, when we're bundled up in our homes, when we're surrounded by the smiles of our family and friends, when we're listening to the music, when we're opening the presents under the tree, we don't often think about those right outside our own door who don't have a bed to sleep in, a roof over their head, or clothes to keep them warm. A few years ago, the Salvation Army estimated that during the Christmas holiday, 700 people would die from exposure to the elements. It's not exactly what we want to be thinking about when all the family's over for dinner. But the reality is Christmas has always had a smell of death around it, right from the beginning. The gospel story from Matthew that you just heard, we don't read that one very often. After all, we don't want to sully our celebration of Christmas by dwelling on the fact that children were murdered because Jesus was born. That'll be another sermon at another time. But think about that story. If Jesus had not been born, the children would not have been murdered. Now, fortunately, this text only comes up once every 3 years in the lectionary cycle, and it comes up on the Sunday after Christmas, which is, for most churches, the lowest attended Sunday throughout the entire year. Which means that if we do choose to read that story, then we aren't going to offend a lot of people because most of you will not be there to hear it. And I have to confess, I have gone back and I keep track of all the sermons I've preached, and I look back through about 35 years now of sermons, and I have never preached on this text. It just doesn't feel like Christmas. But today we lift it up because, like it or not, Christmas and Herod go together, life and death. Herod's father, Herod Antipas, had to fight for Judea. There had been an uprising and a rebellion, and he brought in his army. Rome supported him, and he took back control over the whole area of Judea and Palestine as we know it today. Then, as now, it was a very hotly contested territory. And if you had power there, you could not let your guard down, because as soon as you did, someone was going to come in and try to take control over that land. So when the Magi came and went to Herod and started asking, where's this child who has been born, this king of the Jews? It got Herod's attention. And he started asking questions to find out more about this child and the prophecies about him. And it alarmed him enough that after finding out how old Jesus might possibly be based on when the Magi first saw the star and how long it took them to get to where they're going, he gave the order to murder all of the children under the age of 2 in and around Bethlehem. Just to be sure, he got one child, Jesus. It might help you feel better to know that there is no evidence in the historical record that this massacre ever happened. It might have. We just know that there is no record of it. It's actually more likely it did not happen, but that Jesus' followers started telling this story as a way of highlighting the power of God breaking into the world, where even kings recognized that their time was coming to an end. But historical or not, Herod's reasoning for ordering this massacre is what's important. He was afraid. He was afraid he would lose his kingdom. He was afraid he would lose his power. He was afraid that what he and his father had fought so hard to establish and maintain would be lost. So he did what any king would have done who was afraid. He murdered the future. He murdered children. Scrooge was afraid. As we remember the story from last week when Scrooge went on his journey with the ghost of Christmas past, we saw the hurt and pain of his childhood, and we began to recognize that his mean and gruff and miserly exterior that was there in the present was a result of him being afraid of being hurt again. And so he hoarded everything he had. He used his money like a shield. He cut himself off even from those who did love him, so he would not be hurt. He was afraid. What are you afraid of? What do you fear so much that it stops you from seeing what God is doing in your midst? That it stops you from living with hope and compassion and generosity? What are you afraid of? What scares you so much that you close your eyes to the new thing that God is doing in this world or in your life? One of the most common things God's messengers say to people throughout the entirety of Scripture is, don't be afraid. Even on Christmas, when the angels announced Jesus' birth, the announcement began with, do not fear. Don't be afraid to let go of your fear and embrace joy. Don't let fear dictate how you will live your life. For a lot of us, that fear is rooted in our past being discovered, shame. We're afraid that what has happened in our past will dictate how we live in this present moment. And so in a way it does, because as we try to hide all that stuff from the past, we put ourselves in our own prison. And we put up our armor, and we keep people at a distance because we are afraid that we will be found out. What we forget is this opportunity, this present moment is our opportunity to live. It's our opportunity to discover freedom, to live into that person that Jesus sees when he looks at you. When Jesus looks at you, he does not see the guilt that you carry. He does not see the shame that you hide. He sees the person God created you to be. He doesn't see the person that other people define you as. He sees the person God created you to be. And so often, if you look at Jesus' ministry, he will look at someone and he'll basically say, in those days, in the past, this is how you lived. On this day, make a different choice and be that beautiful person that God created you to be. Be that person that can be God's joy in the world and bring joy to others. That's what Jesus sees when he looks at us. That's what God sees. But it is hard for us to let go of our fear of being found out. It is hard for us to let go of our fear of losing things, because to let go of fear means we then have to trust someone. We have to trust that Jesus isn't going to pull a fast one on us, because we know Jesus sees all that crud in our lives. We have to trust that Jesus isn't all of a sudden going to say, April Fools, all your dirty little secrets, I'm holding them against you. It requires vulnerability to live without fear. Because if we are to be joyful, if we are to be hopeful, if we are to embrace all of this new day and what it brings, then we have to let our guard down and be that person. We have to open ourselves up to joy. We have to open ourselves up to generosity. We have to open ourselves up to compassion. And that requires being vulnerable. And for a lot of us, that really scares us. It doesn't come naturally to most of us. And if you aren't sure if it comes naturally to you or not, just think about how some of these statements resonate with you. I'd like to give more to charity, but I can't because I may not have enough for my needs. I can't let people get too close to me because what if they reject me like so many others have? All my life, people have looked down on me. I can't be the person that I want to be because no one will let me. I have to strike first before someone strikes me. And what about all of those people coming into our country? What if they want power? What if they want influence? Will my power and influence be less? That's the world we live in. So much of how we live today is dictated by our fear of loss and hurt, even if we don't recognize it. For some of us, that fear is based on real experiences. We could look at our past and say, this is what happened, I can't let that happen again, and so I'm living in fear of that by protecting myself now. Some of our fear, though, is based on stories that aren't real, but we have been told them so often that they have become real to us. And so we build this wall of self-protection around us. Ultimately, that means we live in a prison. We aren't able to enjoy the fullness of life that God desires for us, that Christmas invites us to be a part of. Christmas invites us to look at those past stories, those past experiences, and say, those were then. This is now. And what are the new possibilities that Christmas has opened up for me today? Let's not forget that Jesus' whole ministry was about that, helping people let go of the past and see the new possibilities on this day. You see, in those days, shepherds were the outcasts, literally the outsiders. But on this day, they are the favored ones of God to hear before anyone else the announcement of Jesus' birth. They didn't have to be the outsiders anymore because God has brought them in. In those days, it was said, love your friends and hate your enemies. Isn't that what we've grown up with? Because if we hate our enemies, then they can't hurt us, right? That's the myth we tell ourselves. But on this day, Jesus invites us to love our enemies and praise for those who persecute us, just like Jesus loves us. In those days, you hoarded what you had in case you needed it for the future. On this day, Jesus invites us to follow the example of that widow who gave everything she had. We worship a God of abundance. There is enough for everyone. In those days, people saved the best wine, or they served the best wine first, and then they served the really cheap stuff when everybody was too drunk to notice. On this day, the promise of a newborn infant is that the best is yet to come. In those days, those who had power, in those days, those with means had power. On this day, the meek shall inherit the earth. In those days, kings were found in palaces of marble and gold. On this day, the king is found in a borrowed stable in a manger. In those days, Scrooge wore his pain like an impenetrable shield. And on this day, he cries when he learns that Tiny Tim will die if he does not change. Death has always been a part of the Christmas story. And maybe that's because there are things that need to die. Perhaps what needs to die is our fear of not having enough, so we can live joyfully in the now and share with those who don't have enough. Perhaps what needs to die is our captivity to the past. I mean, we are so quick to judge, as if whatever someone did to us in the past should forever be a stain on them that never goes away. We forget sometimes that the grudges that we hold don't stain the other person, they stain us. Maybe what needs to die is our quick reaction to judge and hold grudges so that we can be more joyful and embrace the now of God's gift. Perhaps what needs to die is our fear of losing power or influence. Then we're free to receive the gift of other voices and the wisdom they bring to this world. Perhaps what also needs to die is our fear of being hurt. Remembering that it was on this day, this Christmas day, that God came to us as the most vulnerable creature on earth, a newborn infant, completely dependent on others. God knew and God knows that it is only when we make ourselves vulnerable and open ourselves up to being hurt that we can truly love and receive love. Perhaps what needs to die is our worship of those days, so that we can see the opportunities of this day that God brings to us. I encourage you, as we continue this journey towards celebrating the birth of this vulnerable God amongst us, I encourage you to consider what needs to die for you. What fears need to die in order for Christmas to really be that new day for you? Let's take a moment to reflect as we prepare our hearts for prayer.